3, 2, 1.
Very hard to do in Los Angeles right now as an art maker, as an artist.
Tell me a little bit about the premise of the SPAN exhibition at the Fremantle Arts Centre.
Indeed. SPAN is bringing to 5 local artists from Perth, although they have lived elsewhere. Club Girl, Tanya Lee, Susanna Castleton, Olga Soronis and Andrew Sunley Smith. Their work as a whole doesn't critique or question, but rather just discusses the idea that there's 2 points to any discussion, again, but those 2 points are not bookends. They simply hold a space between them, which I think in terms of artwork is an interesting discussion. It's a discussion about process and also a discussion about the borders and boundaries between not only a start point and end point, but ethically a right and a wrong. And I think that artwork that acknowledges that it exists along a point somewhere between starting and ending is a really interesting artwork, because it's not finishing, it's not starting, it's rather becoming. And the work in the show acknowledges its ongoingness. A lot of the work is not necessarily performative, but it acknowledges its process. And it's really interesting to put a collection of artists together that are not using a gallery space to be a finite position. They're using a space to discuss their work as an ongoing process, geographically, thematically, materially. And I think in terms of the point of these 5 artists, very much conceptually, because they're constantly questioning their art and their art processes. So that's a kind of pretty broad point of view. But
you mentioned that each of these artists has spent time elsewhere. Do you think that feeds into the work and also the curatorial premise here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, personally, I've travelled a fair bit too, and I think that travel and acknowledging different points of view in art sort of come together. It's an interesting question. I think, just thinking through the processes, I think all of their work is influenced by coming from or going to somewhere. Susanna's work specifically does that in being located elsewhere, but then discussing the idea of travel and movement, not only through leisure, but through the desire to be elsewhere. I think Olga's, she's moved around a little bit in terms of an artist, but this specific process she's working through with hair and the weaving of hair, she's done through different locations around WA and different studio residencies. So that's definitely a big part of her process, moving. Clyde's is about the actual act of moving, and his work discusses the politics of that and the ethics of having to move, and the want to move and the need to move. And he's moved around a bit as an artist too, and he's lived elsewhere. He's lived in Melbourne and New York. Andrew, he's his work is based a lot on some time he spent off grid in Canada, and again having to move from one place to another. And Tanya's come from country and has had a different lifestyle growing up, and so again I think and the ethics of living next door to each other in her work, I think probably comes from that. So I think it's a good question. It's interesting to think about it.
A lot of the works have, as part of their theme, the crossing of borders. And can you tell me to what extent do you feel that there is something of the spirit of the times in dealing with that issue?
Yeah, the zeitgeist.
Yeah.
I think I was aware of that, putting the artists together, and I think that those discussions, particularly pertaining to Australian politics, but also to the political zeitgeist of the times. It's definitely in there. That's the fridge going.
Yeah, that's okay.
I think that the interest in political boundaries and cultural boundaries is very much of the time, and is specific to media today. But in terms of art processes, I don't know. I'm not sure about that. I think there's a more of a timelessness to the processes and the way these guys work. But in terms of the idea of crossing boundaries or the movement of global populations, yeah, definitely, I think so.
It's interesting, I think, that for these artists as well who belong to a particular kind of generation, that within their lifetimes, the way that we think about boundaries and borders has changed as well, I think, internationally.
Yeah, which way though? I don't know. Do you mean in terms of media or the?
I suppose going back, 20 years maybe, the idea of, the borders of a nation state was starting to be seen as being more kind of permeable, and things like Europe seem to kind of reinforce this idea, and yet now we live in a time where in Australia, and also you have to think about Donald Trump and the wall. The idea that borders are now becoming extremely protected, walled. The idea of permeable boundaries and borders seems to be it seems to be going out with the sort of a kind of a liberal politics that has gone with it.
Yeah, I guess the discussion about the zeitgeist again comes back to that, but it's an interesting one when you think about that, and you're looking at the news constantly, and 24-hour news is bombarding us all the time. But it's relatively easy to say that borders are doing this or boundaries are doing this, but I really think it's much more complicated than that. And I think that the idea of setting up a national boundaries is a fascinating one, but it's not so much the boundaries, it's the kind of attitude to nationalism and a certain sense of ownership of culture, which in a post-colonial, post-global, post-everything world is kind of fascinating. It's not a knee-jerk reaction. It's this kind of attitude that, well, if we can't place ourselves in the world, who are we? What are we here for? But when I was growing up, it was kind of idealistic and beautiful to think about the world as non-boundaried and freedom of movement, freedom of trade. But I also grew up in a time in Australia where there was constant discussion about what does it mean to be Australian and who are we? And I think that I'm still in that kind of space personally, and maybe this show is part of that. Thinking about we're kind of localized as people. We live our lives in a certain place, but we're always in this position of feeling caught between being here and being there. And I think, in terms of this show, that's a big part of it.
Do you think that there is something in the kind of the cultural and geographical condition of Western Australia that is particular to that condition?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I do. Indeed. Yeah, I do, and I, you know, I've written about the idea of colonial attitudes to Western Australia. Certainly, Indigenous attitudes go back a long time, and the Indigenous land that we live on has its own amazing history. Colonially, and when you think about where this exhibition is at the Fremantle Arts Centre, this is a colonial building, right? So it's a convict labour building built in the 1860s, and where it is situated up on a hill looking out over the Indian Ocean is, you know, it's pivotal and to these types of shows and this type of work, because, yeah, I mean, every day driving to work here, you're looking out at the ocean and there's a horizon out there, and I think in the colonial times I can only imagine that people were sitting here looking out at the Indian Ocean and thinking, you know, where are we and what's happened and what am I missing out on? So immediately you're grounded in a point of being here, whilst perhaps wanting to be there, you know. And that attitude maybe has changed, maybe it hasn't, but the horizon here on the West Coast has always had that kind of lure of the other, and of the romantic notion that, you know, life is perhaps being lived elsewhere culturally. I don't know if that's the case anymore, I'm not sure, but certainly within a group of artists in this kind of work that we're looking at and span, there's that discussion of, yeah, or perhaps a feeling that we're caught between points. And how does that play out when really digitally we can be anywhere we want to be? And certainly a lot of us are now living isolated on purpose. Andrew's work comes to mind, with the notion that we are off-grid and that's a conscious decision. And geographically we could be anywhere and still be partaking in the world. In that sense, putting up a wall or putting up a boundary around you doesn't make any sense at all. Because of course you can't control, you know, what's coming in and out. But yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think that West Coast or maybe it's just a West Coast phenomenon in general, but you know, the West Coast of Australia, yeah, it's still that location, it's still an isolationism, but really within that, for me, the horizon speaks of not a lack but a potential and a possibility, and I think that's interesting in terms of moving between spaces. There's a choice there. You can keep moving, you can cross boundaries, you can come back and live in isolation. And a lot of the work, yeah, I think a lot of the work that's come out of this particular building over the last 6 to 10 years perhaps discusses that, and this show in particular, I think, thinks about that notion of, if I'm here, you know, in digital society there's often this feeling that you're missing out, or you can't be everywhere at once. So we are being stretched constantly like that, but it's an interesting psychological condition to be in, isn't it?
It seems to me that a lot of it is about really the tension between the shrinking of distance psychologically through technology, whether that be digital or the increased capacity for air travel. You know, Qantas apparently are thinking about, you know, with the new Dreamliner, of having a non-stop flight from Perth to Heathrow, for instance. That on one hand, and on the other hand, the actual you know, physical distance that is there, regardless of how technology may psychologically shrink that distance.
Yeah, or maybe, you know, we are physical in the end, despite all our best efforts of pulling our atoms down and replacing them elsewhere. I mean, yeah, we are physical beings, and you know, Tanya's work comes to mind for me. You know, that idea that we're living across from someone, and where, you know, that conversation is literally over the fence, and yet we're isolated in our lives. We're all living our own lives. We're all on our own trajectories. In the end, we're physical. It's interesting, I think, for me anyway, coming back to Perth after travelling a lot, sometimes you feel that distance between people, or the personal space is maybe somehow slightly longer here. I don't know how one proves that, but the physicality of living in the wide open expanses of the West Coast here probably come into that a little bit. But yeah, I think despite our best efforts, we are physical and we're not quite at beam me up. Scotty times, are we? I know Richard Branson is trying to get us out into space and then back down again, and that would be a 2-hour trip between Perth and London. So we'll see how that goes. I mean, that's what people commute these days anyway.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Tammy's work as well. Then I think one of the interesting things about her work is the distance really that a lot of us have with the people we live amongst. And her work is about sort of bridging that distance by doing these very intimate things, really, like brushing someone's hair, brushing their teeth, feeding them, and that kind of thing. So to me, it seems like her work is still about it's still about distance within a confined space, really. Yeah.
It's almost an impenetrable distance, isn't it?
Yeah, a very real and virtual distance that we have with our neighbours.
Yeah, and the comedy within her work is just, I love it, and I love the farcical nature to try to break down boundaries, because as I say, I think ultimately we are physical, well, ultimately we're all stardust, right, but we are physical beings, and I think, her work crosses boundaries of emotion, dependency, the need for emotive response and comfort, and to look after yourself and those around you, in a real sense. And I think it's beautiful to see that sort of played out in a comedic sense. In that, we often it's this kind of conflict in a lot of the works. We're here, we're there, but in between there's this constantly gaps to bridge, and really ultimately it's our choice as to how far down that line we go. As I said at the start, within these works is the start and the end process of the artworks themselves are kind of bridging those gaps constantly. And I think this is an ongoing discussion with artists in their work, is that it's not only us and you or people that we're trying to bridge gaps between. It's always the work, the artist to the work, and then the work to the audience. There's those gaps as well, which are very much articulated in these works.
From the process of curator, what sort of comes first in thinking through an exhibition such as this?
I don't know. I mean, well, it's different for every show. But I think with this one in particular, I was really interested in the idea of non-stagnant work and the idea of works being part of an ongoing motion in the artist's process. So I really wanted to look at process, thematics, and then the artists themselves, and to try and bring this idea of bridging points. And I think that when I started looking at artists, I was thinking, how do I bring a whole bunch of artists together that are talking about what at times can be, if you think about it, quite an ethereal concept. But the discussion that we've had is great, because it, straight away you're looking at politics and geographical boundaries and the physical nature of things. So it's not really that ethereal. It's actually the way we live our lives. We get up in the morning, we're trying to get to the end point of the day, and everything that happens in between is our life, But it was great to come to these artists' works, because for me, these guys specifically are looking at that as a process of making, and that will continue in the galleries, because Olga's and Clyde's are performative, and they are constantly moving through the show, and the other works are all activated by viewers, but also the medium that they're in. They could all be equally described as performative in some way. So yeah, it's all these different layers of concepts, I guess. But the ultimate endpoint, I guess, for me is that the work and the artist that's making the work and is involved in the process of the work, that their work in the gallery space is articulated in such a way that it doesn't diminish their work, it actually adds to a discussion. And so I love exhibitions and I love work that gives you a departure point and allows the audience to come in and say, well, okay, well, if this is about this bridging of gaps, then there's another gap because it's me creating another gap and another discussion which I'm going to take out. So yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where I was at with the show. And I think the name says that, right?
Yeah. And when you conceive of an exhibition like this and you select the artists, I suppose this is a difficult kind of question in a way, but to what extent are you expecting the unexpected, to be surprised by what you get out of what you select?
Interesting. Well, the work, thinking through the pieces now, a lot of the work has been shown in some way.
Yeah.
So Tanya's has been shown before, Susanna's has been published in some way before, Andrew's been working through his work for a little bit of time, so I know it. So the work's already there. Clyde's has shown before at Monofoma. Olga's been working through hers in different residencies. So I think I was being quite deliberate in choosing work that was well down the line. But in doing so and putting it together in this way and putting it into the space where it's going to be activated, that work is not going to sit still. It's going to be, reinvigorated. But it's also a conscious thing for me. I think I wanted the idea of that if this work is about discussing breaking down borders or getting over points or breaking down boundaries, then how, if you show it again or shown in a different mould with a different audience, how does that happen again? How will that keep happening? We'll find out. I'm not sure, but I think the surprise is and it's constantly surprising to me. It doesn't matter how it works or what happens in the gallery spaces. Once you put something in a space and articulate it in a gallery space, despite your best efforts to control things, the audience and the viewers and the space itself over time, it's constantly changing and constantly surprising. So yeah, that's the best part, right? I think.
So in a way, is that kind of like letting it go out into the world and having to, it's almost like letting a child leave home and make its own mistakes.
I'm not sure I haven't got to that stage with my kids yet, but I guess so. But also that, I guess as a curator, for me, I'm not that interested in putting endpoints into galleries, and so by grabbing something that's been shown before and then putting it in a different context, it's kind of arguing the point that a work is never finished, and an artist's processes aren't finished. They're constantly being re-engaged, and it's exciting. It's exciting to me.